right now at this clear's throat exact second, you are sitting inside the largest graveyard that has ever existed. Not a graveyard of people, a graveyard of species. Scientists estimate that somewhere around 4 billion species have existed on Earth since life first appeared. Take a guess at how many of those are still alive today. Not half, not a quarter, less than 0.1%. 99.9% of every species that has ever lived on this planet is gone. Completely, permanently. And if there's a mind behind all of this, designing life with care and purpose, that mind built a system where near total annihilation isn't the exception, it's a default setting. Let's sit with that number for a second, because it's easy to say and hard to actually picture. Imagine every species that has ever crawled, swum, flown, or photosynthesized on this planet lined up in a single row stretching farther than you could walk in a lifetime. Now imagine walking down that line, and for every 1,000 species you pass, only one is still alive somewhere on Earth today. The other 999 are gone, not sleeping, not hiding, erased, in the same way a word is erased from a page. The ink lifted clean off, the space filled in with something else entirely. Trilobites crawled across ocean floors for nearly 300 million years, longer than dinosaurs existed, longer than mammals have existed, longer than almost anything you could name. They are gone. Ammonites filled the oceans in shells, built like sculpted spirals, more diverse and more successful than almost anything alive in the sea today. Gone. Entire branches of the evolutionary tree, some of them stranger than anything a science fiction writer could invent, simply stopped. No sequel, no epilogue, just silence where a heartbeat used to be. Here's the question worth sitting with, and it's not really a biology question, even though it sounds like one. If a creator designed life on purpose, with intention, with the kind of care a craftsman puts into something they love, why would the operating instructions for that creation include as a built-in and unavoidable feature that almost everything made will eventually be destroyed? You wouldn't build a house where 99.9% of the rooms are engineered to eventually collapse. You wouldn't write a story where nearly every character you introduce is quietly killed off page with no acknowledgement, no closure, nothing. And yet, that is, without exaggeration, the actual architecture of life on Earth. Extinction isn't a glitch in the system. It's the single most common outcome the system produces. The usual answer people reach for is evolution itself. Species go extinct because something better replaces them, because nature is constantly refining and improving, weeding out what doesn't work in favor of what does. It's a comforting story. Survival of the fittest, progress through competition, a kind of upward climb toward better adapted life. And there's real science behind natural selection. That part isn't in dispute. But here's where it gets stranger, because that comforting story doesn't actually match what the fossil record shows. Most extinctions weren't a slow, graceful handoff from an inferior species to a superior one. They were catastrophes. About 252 million years ago, in an event scientists now call the Great Dying, something most likely a series of massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia poisoned the atmosphere and ocean so severely that roughly 96% of all marine species and 70% of land species vanished in a geological instant, not because they were poorly designed, not because something more advanced outcompeted them. They were simply in the wrong place when the sky and sea turned against them. 66 million years ago, an asteroid, roughly the size of a small city, slammed into what is now Mexico, and within a geological blink, somewhere around 75% of all species on Earth, including every non-avian dinosaur that had dominated the planet for over 150 million years, were gone. That's not evolution refining a design. That's a random rock from space ending a 150 million year run in an afternoon. Geologists can actually point to the exact physical evidence of that afternoon. There's a thin, distinct layer of clay found in rock formations all over the planet, dated precisely 66 million years ago, unusually rich in a rare element called iridium that's far more common in asteroids than in Earth's crust. That single, almost impossibly thin line in the rock is the physical signature of the day the ground rules for life on this planet changed completely. Above that line, no non-avian dinosaurs. Below it, they had ruled the planet for over 150 million years. The transition between dominant and gone isn't even a visible gap in most samples. It's a few millimeters of clay. Think about what that means for the species living through it. If there had been any minds capable of understanding what was happening, there was no warning, no gradual decline, no divine intervention holding back a fate that had by any reasonable definition already been sealed the moment that object crossed into Earth's atmosphere. The system didn't pause. It didn't make an exception for the most successful, most diverse group of land animals the planet had ever produced. It simply continued running exactly the way it always runs, indifferent to how impressive or dominant anything happened to be the moment before impact and the great dying in the asteroid. Impact aren't isolated incidents. They're just the two most famous entries on a list of 5 major mass extinction events that paleontologists have identified across Earth's history, and the pattern across all 5 is unsettlingly consistent. About 440 million years ago, a sudden and severe ice age likely triggered by a burst of intense radiation from a nearby cosmic event wiped out somewhere around 85% of marine species in a world that at the time contained almost nothing but marine species. About 375 million years ago, a prolonged series of environmental collapses, possibly tied to the sudden spread of the very first forest changing the chemistry of the oceans, eliminated roughly 75% of species on the planet. Read that last one again because it deserves a second look. The rise of trees, plants doing exactly what plants are supposed to do, may have helped trigger one of the deadliest extinction events in Earth's history, simply by pulling carbon out of the atmosphere faster than the rest of the ecosystem could adapt to the change. Life didn't need an external enemy to nearly destroy itself. It very possibly did it just by growing. And roughly 201 million years ago, a fourth event, likely driven by another massive volcanic episode as an ancient supercontinent began tearing itself apart, cleared out around 75% of species, yet again opening the ecological space that dinosaurs would go on to dominate for the next 135 million years, right up until the asteroid arrived to clear the board once more. And here's the rehook, because it gets even stranger the deeper you look. The fossil record itself is almost unbelievably incomplete. Fossilization requires a very specific, very rare set of conditions. Rapid burial, the right minerals, the right pressure, millions of years without erosion or geological disruption, destroying the evidence. Because of that, scientists estimate that the vast majority of species that have ever existed left no fossil evidence at all. Not a rare fossil, not a fragment, nothing. Whole species, entire evolutionary experiments appeared, lived out their existence, and disappeared so completely that we don't even know they happened. We're not just looking at a graveyard. We're looking at a graveyard where most of the headstones were never carved in the first place. There's a place on Earth that makes this invisibility problem almost physically tangible, and it might be the strangest rehook in this entire story. In the Canadian Rockies, there's a rock formation called the Burgess Shale laid down roughly 500 million years ago, during a period scientists call the Cambrian explosion, when complex animal life diversified faster and more radically than at almost any other point in the planet's history because of a freak set of geological conditions that one location preserved. Soft-bodied creatures in extraordinary detail, not just bones and shells, but the actual outlines of skin, gills, and internal structures that almost never survive fossilization. And what paleontologists found there wasn't a tidy preview of familiar animal groups slowly finding their modern forms. It was a menagerie of body plans so genuinely alien that scientists still argue about how some of them are even related to anything alive today. A creature called hallucigenia walking on stilt-like spines with anatomy so confusing that researchers spent decades unsure which end was ahead. A five-eyed swimming animal called Opabinia with a long-clawed trunk that resembles nothing evolution has produced since. These weren't failed prototypes on the way to something better. As far as the evidence shows, they were fully realized functioning creatures that lived, competed, reproduced, and then were erased so completely that if that one shale formation hadn't happened to preserve them by accident, we would have no idea they ever existed at all. Multiply the Burgess Shale by every location on Earth where those exact freak conditions didn't occur, and you start to understand the true scale of what's actually been lost. Not just species, but entire categories of living structure that nothing alive today even hints at. Paleontologists sometimes describe this as a fundamental sampling problem baked permanently into the science itself. We are trying to reconstruct the full history of life on Earth using a record that, by its own nature, only ever captured a tiny, biased, accidental fraction of what actually happened. Every conclusion drawn from a fossil record isn't a complete account. It's an educated guess built from the handful of chapters that happened to survive being burned. Now here's the twist that turns this from a sad biology fact into something much stranger philosophically. The late evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould proposed a famous thought experiment. Imagine you could rewind the tape of life all the way back to its beginning and let it play out again. Would you get anything close to the same result? Would you get dinosaurs again? Would you get mammals again? Would you get anything even resembling a human being? Gould's answer, based on decades of studying how contingent and accident-driven evolutionary history actually is, was almost certainly not. Change one asteroid trajectory by a fraction of a degree. Change one volcanic eruption's timing by a few thousand years. Change which handful of small, unremarkable creatures happen to survive a mass extinction event, and the entire subsequent chapter of life on Earth rewrites itself completely. Humanity on this view isn't the point of the story. We're not the intended destination. Evolution was building toward. We're a survivor of a demolition lottery. The way a single house standing after a hurricane isn't proof the storm was designed to spare it. It's just where the dice landed. Think about what that actually implies for the idea of a creator with a plan. If the fossil record is any guide, evolution on Earth doesn't read like the deliberate unfolding of a single intended outcome. It reads like an almost unimaginably wasteful trial and error process where the vast, overwhelming majority of attempts are simply discarded, most without a trace, and the tiny surviving remainder is shaped less by design and more by which random catastrophe happened to miss them. If you were watching from outside and you didn't already believe there was a plan, nothing about the pattern you'd see would suggest one. It would look exactly like what you'd expect from a process with no memory, no goal, and no regard at all for what it destroys along the way. There's a version of this argument that a thoughtful believer might raise at this point, and it deserves a fair hearing rather than a dismissal. Much of the classic reasoning about why a good creator allows suffering leans on free will. The idea that moral evil exists because conscious beings were given the freedom to choose, and that freedom is worth the cost. But a trilobite didn't choose to go extinct in an ocean poisoned by volcanic gas. An ammonite didn't send its way into an asteroid impact. Whatever explains human suffering through free will simply doesn't apply to the overwhelming majority of the 4 billion species this pattern has erased, because almost none of them were making moral choices at all. They were just alive, doing what living things do when the rules of a system that supposedly created them turned against them anyway. If free will explains why humans suffer, it explains almost nothing about why 99.9% of everything else that has ever lived didn't make it. There's also a strange asymmetry worth noticing in what does survive. Certain species, horseshoe crabs, nautiluses, a handful of others, sometimes called living fossils, have persisted for hundreds of millions of years with barely any structural change at all, quietly outlasting the dinosaurs, outlasting the ice ages, outlasting nearly everything else around them. If you're looking for evidence of a deliberate hand preserving what matters, these ancient survivors look at first glance like exactly that. But look closer and the pattern falls apart just as fast. Horseshoe crabs didn't survive because they were favored. They survived because their body plan happened to be a good fit for a stable, low-competition environment on the ocean floor. The same blind mechanism of chance and circumstance that erased almost everything around them. Survival across the whole of Earth's history tracks remarkably well with luck and fit, and remarkably poorly with anything resembling favor, virtue, or importance. Let's push this even further because the story isn't finished, and it isn't ancient history either. Right now, today, scientists studying current extinction rates estimate that species are disappearing somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times faster than the natural background rate seen throughout most of geological history. Some researchers have started using the phrase 6 mass extinction to describe what's happening on Earth right now in your lifetime, driven this time not by an asteroid or a volcano, but by the activity of a single species, us. If that framing holds up, it means the same fundamental pattern that erased the trilobites and the ammonites and the non-avian dinosaurs hasn't stopped. It simply changed its trigger. The machinery of extinction that has run continuously for over 3.5 billion years didn't pause once, ever, for anyone, no matter how successful, no matter how dominant, no matter how seemingly essential to the story a species appear to be at its peak. There's a modern experiment underway right now that accidentally reveals just how one-directional this whole system really is, and it's worth pausing on before we go further. In recent years, several research teams have pursued what's often called de-extinction, using preserved DNA and gene editing technology to try to bring back species like the woolly mammoth or the passenger pigeon, animals that were driven to extinction within the last few centuries, well within the reach of preserved genetic material. It's an extraordinary technical effort, and it captures something very human, an instinct to reverse a mistake, to undo an erasure, to prove that extinction doesn't have to be the final word. And yet, even in the most optimistic scenarios researchers describe, what would emerge wouldn't be a true mammoth or a true passenger pigeon. It would be a genetically modified approximation built from a related living species with mammoth or passenger pigeon genes spliced in, missing the specific ecological context, the specific population history, the specific accumulated variations that made the original species exactly what it was. Even with the full weight of modern science deliberately trying as hard as possible, humanity cannot simply reverse what extinction erased. If a technological civilization with genetic engineering can't undo it, That tells you something about how absolute the erasure actually is when it happens naturally, unplanned, to a species with no one advocating to bring it back at all. And here's the detail that turns this from unsettling into something closer to inevitable, even if humanity somehow avoids every self-inflicted extinction risk, every war, every collapse, every catastrophe we might cause ourselves. The deeper laws of physics still have the final word. The sun will eventually exhaust its hydrogen fuel and expand into a red giant, likely engulfing, or at minimum, sterilizing Earth entirely in roughly 5 billion years. Long before that, in a much shorter cosmic time frame, the sun's gradually increasing brightness will boil away Earth's oceans and end complex life as we know it, and zoom out even further to the full lifespan. The universe is ahead of it, and the picture gets almost absolute. Every star will eventually burn out. Every galaxy will eventually go dark. In the almost incomprehensibly distant future, physicists describe an era, sometimes called the heat death of the universe, where all usable energy is spread out evenly and nothing, nor life, nor light, nor motion of any meaningful kind can happen anymore, anywhere, which means if current physics holds, the sentence being written for absolutely every species, past, present, and future, without a single exception, isn't some of you will die. It's all of you will, eventually, with total certainty. And there is no version of the story where any life survives to the very end. There's a strange comfort some people reach for at this point, and it's worth naming directly. Maybe the thinking goes, extinction isn't really an ending at all. If there's an afterlife, a soul, some continuation beyond the physical body, maybe the loss only looks total because we're only measuring the physical record. But even the most generous versions of that idea tend to be built for beings with something like a soul to continue, a category that, in almost every theological tradition that discusses it seriously, is reserved for humans, and sometimes not even confidently for them. Trilobites, ammonites, the five-eyed creatures of the Burgess Shale, no significant theological tradition has seriously proposed for them. Whatever comfort that idea offers, it offers to almost nobody in this story, except us, which means it explains almost none of the 4 billion species this pattern actually describes. So step back and look at the full shape of it. For billion species, and 99.9% of them already gone, most without leaving so much as a trace that they ever existed. The survivors shaped not by a guiding hand, but by which catastrophe happened to miss them, a sixth extinction potentially unfolding right now, driven by the very species that likes to imagine itself as the reason the whole story was written, and waiting at the very end of the timeline, a physical law that guarantees the same fate for every remaining species that has ever lived or ever will. Extinction, total and final, without exception, written into the fabric of the universe itself. There's a reason none of this feels as urgent or as real to us as it should, and it's worth naming honestly, because it's not a flaw in the argument. It's a flaw in human perception. Our minds are built to process loss on the scale of a single lifetime, a handful of decades, a small circle of relationships. We grieve individuals. We struggle to grieve statistics, let alone geological time spans that dwarf every unit of time our biology evolved to make sense of. For billion species and 99.9% of them gone is a number so large it stops registering as loss at all and starts registering as trivia, a fact you could mention at dinner without anyone's expression changing. But scale doesn't determine whether something is happening. It only determines whether we're capable of feeling it. The trilobites that lived for nearly 300 million years weren't a statistic to themselves, whatever their inner experience might have been. Each one was in whatever limited sense. The word applies to a trilobite, a life. Multiply that by 4 billion species, most represented by uncountable individual organisms across their own runs on this planet. And the true scope of what the system has erased isn't just hard to feel. It's arguably impossible for a single human mind to feel it at the scale it deserves. If there's a mind behind this, one that's supposed to be loving, purposeful, attentive to every sparrow, as the old language puts it, that mind chose to build a universe where near total erasure isn't a punishment reserved for the worst outcomes. It's the baseline. It's what happens by default to everyone, given enough time, whether they were magnificent or forgettable, whether they left a fossil or not, whether anyone ever knew they were here at all. Maybe there's a reason for that we simply can't see from inside the story. Maybe extinction, however brutal it looks from where we're standing, serves some purpose too vast and too slow for a single lifespan to perceive. Or maybe the fossil record is telling us something more honest than any explanation we built to soften it, that whatever is running this universe isn't keeping score, isn't preserving what it loves, and was never particularly interested in who survives long enough to ask why. There's one more angle worth sitting with before we close, and it's the most personal one, because it isn't really about trilobites or ammonites at all. It's about you and everyone you've ever known, and every species alive on Earth today, including the ones we've grown so used to seeing that we've stopped imagining a world without them. If the pattern that is held for 3.5 billion years continues to hold, and every available line of evidence says it will, then the 99.9% figure isn't a historical curiosity about the deep past. It's a preview. It's the fate currently being written, one geological blink at a time, for every living thing you can currently see, hear, or love. The only open question isn't whether, it's when, and by what mechanism, and whether anything at all will be left to notice somewhere a very long time from now, if intelligent life still exists. Anywhere at all, some future mind might dig into the rock layers of our own era the way we dig into the Burgess Shale today, and find a thin, strange band packed with the compressed remains of an unprecedented number of species, disappearing all at once across every continent in a geological instant. They might study it the way we study the iridium layer, trying to reconstruct exactly what happened and why, working only from whatever fragments happen to survive, and whatever conclusion they reach about us, about whether we mattered, about whether anything we built or believed or loved changed the outcome, even slightly, will be built from the same kind of accidental, incomplete evidence we've been using this whole time to understand everything that came before us. The record never keeps everything. It only keeps what happens to survive, and it has never once asked permission before deciding which stories get told. Either way, somewhere beneath your feet, right now, in rock laid down hundreds of millions of years ago, they're the remains of species that no living thing will ever see again, that no fossil will ever record, that existed, mattered to themselves in whatever way life mattered to them, and vanished so completely that the only proof they were ever here at all is the